A move from a relentless life with hurry and all of these demands, no space, to a restorative pace of life. Welcome to Practicing the Practices, a learning and experiential podcast geared towards helping you apprentice with Jesus. I'm Brad, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Casey. And before we get into episode 202 on simplicity of schedule, we thought we would riff a little bit about areas of complexity that maybe really frustrate us or drive us nuts. Casey, you had one that really you're passionate about.
Every single time, Brad, I go to the Cheesecake Factory, I am overcome with anxiety over the length of their menu.
It's only 79 pages.
It's just too long, and it shouldn't be that I can get a cheeseburger, or I can get tacos, or I can get like a Chinese stir fry. Like, it's too many choices.
Well, if there's any Cheesecake Factory representatives listening to this episode, we are open to a sponsorship, despite what my co-host has said about your
I love the
restaurant.
Cheesecake Factory.
So
it's just a lot of options.
I don't have that problem, because when I go to Cheesecake Factory, despite the 79-page menu, there's only 3 items on the menu for me. There are the taquitos in the appetizer section.
Okay.
Delicious. There is the chicken Madeira in the entree section.
I can attest. That is delicious.
It's 7,000 calories of amazingness. And then there is the Oreo Explosion Cheesecake. It's the only 3 items on the cheesecake menu for me.
Do you eat all 3 of these items in one trip, or are you kind of choosing one when you go?
Listen.
No judgment.
It feels like there's some judgment. It feels like when people say no judgment, that they mean judgment, but they don't want to mean judgment.
I want to recreate the Pastor Brad special at the Cheesecake Factory. So do I go appetizer
In
taquitos?
my youth, I could take care of all of that.
Okay.
Today, let's say it's Julie and I. We would split the taquitos. I would eat half of the Madeira, save the other half for tomorrow's lunch. And then I would dominate the Oreo cheesecake.
So the answer is yes, we're getting all 3 of those in one trip.
Praise the Lord.
Okay.
Well, now that we have sufficiently confessed to gluttony on my end and how the Cheesecake Factory is too complex for Casey, we are talking about simplicity. And Casey, I thought you did a great job of framing the definition for it in our first episode, that, we're not trying to eliminate joy, but we're actually trying to maximize joy. And that simplicity is not the elimination of everything for our life, but it is the deprioritization of things that matter less, so that the things that matter most, our life with God, our families, can get first billing. And so today we're talking about simplicity of schedule, or as your husband titled it recently when he was teaching along these lines, that there's healing in the margins of our life. Now, Casey, knowing that we were going to talk about this topic, I went back to some teaching that I did 6 years ago at our church in a series called Margin. And in this particular sermon, I was teaching on how we should create space for what matters most in our life. And so, knowing that we're going to talk about this, I pull up my old notes, and I found this opening monologue from 2017. And it shook me because of how much our world has accelerated just in 6 years. So here it is. So in 2017, I said this to our church. For those of you who look at the stock market and want to spot an up-and-coming market trend, 2008 would have been the year to target a product that's grown by over 60% and is trending towards being a $17 billion industry. And that product was energy drinks, Red Bull, Monster, et cetera. There's so many more now. Now, that was 6 years ago. And so I read that, and of course, my curiosity took over, and I wondered, how much has it grown since 2017? Well, in 2024, 6 years later, I did some digging, and the global energy market was valued in 2022 at $91 billion and is estimated to be over $100 million today.
It's crazy.
As we mentioned, before, it would be hard for anyone born in another century or an underdeveloped part of the world to even imagine our lives today. They cannot fathom our complexities. When you think about this in the scope of time, it took the Pilgrims 66 days on their voyage to America. But you and I could pop on a flight today and be in Europe in less than 24 hours. For most of human history, you couldn't work after the sun set. And if you're a college student listening to this podcast, you don't even think about starting your study or homework till after the sun has set. Because we can do so much, we often do so much. Our lives, though they are finite, we sometimes live as they're limitless. We eat most of what we want, we buy most of what we want, and we say yes to almost everything we want to do. And Casey, we are stressed out in many cases. We are anxious because we have infinite opportunities. And despite sometimes our attempts, we have very finite lives.
It's so true, Brad. And the sad thing is, as someone who really loves joy and to have fun as an Enneagram 7, the sad thing is that the more opportunities that we have, the less we actually experience joy and abundance in all of these activities of our lives. And that's a very kingdom way of looking at things, that the more we have, the less we experience joy. And the less we have, the more we experience joy. It's a really upside down way of thinking. John Kabat-Zinn says this: simplicity means going fewer places in one day rather than more, seeing less so I can see more, doing less so I can do more, acquiring less so I can have more. And so in our upside down kingdom thinking that we're working every day to embrace, we really need to get comfortable with this concept that less in the kingdom is actually more. And this is really the way Jesus lived his life. He always had space and margin in his life to be interrupted. He didn't multitask. We never really see him in a hurry, though people in his life, his disciples, the people around him, the crowds, were constantly pressuring him to hurry. And he never really capitulated to that. He never hurried. He always had time for who was in front of him. So if we're committed to apprenticing to Jesus, we really must find a way to embrace his countercultural and against the grain pace.
And we know there are the inner lawyer inside of us that begins to say, hey, this isn't realistic. We've got to be productive. Listen, there was no one more productive than Jesus, right? I mean, he changed the world. What we're after here is not some sort of laissez-faire laziness. That's not it. But we're after recognizing that there must be space, margin is the word we're using, in between our load, what we can bear, what we should bear, and our limitations. Your husband, Neil, when he was teaching on this concept in his message on the healing and the margins, he described this quote by a man named Richard Swenson, in which he his point is that we live our lives at 120% capacity. Not 100% capacity, at 120% capacity. No wonder we feel stress, anxiety, and then when you have a snowstorm like the one we've kind of went through the last few days like it becomes a little bit jolting. Like we enjoy it for the first 24 hours, right? We get a break. And then all of a sudden we start to feel that anxiousness, like, oh no, I'm not able to go here. I'm not able to do that. I'm not getting those things done. Well, the idea of this margin, this space is that we ought not live at 120%. That's easy. But nor should we live at 100% capacity. But rather we should live at an 80% capacity so that when interruptions come, and they will come in the form of your children, in the form of something that happens at your workplace, in the form of a neighbor who has a need, in the form of sickness or whatever, when those interruptions come, we can actually live the way Jesus did. And instead of being totally put off and frustrated by those interruptions, we actually have the emotional and time space to be redemptive in those places.
So true, and so hard to think about living in that 80%. And if we want to live in such a countercultural way and really live at this more 80% capacity, I think we really need to understand the why behind what we're doing. So why are we wanting to simplify our schedule? Is it just because we want to be more efficient and get more done? No, it is not. I love this quote by Jan Johnson, who has a beautiful book on simplicity. Highly recommend. And she said this: the point of simplicity is not efficiency or increased productivity or even living a healthier, more relaxed life. The point is making space for treasuring God's own self. And we see that in Jesus's life. The space and the margin that he had in his life, he usually used it one of two ways. The first was to go and spend time with his heavenly Father and to go away and be quiet, which she calls here treasuring God's own self. And then the other way he used his margin was to pay attention to the people in front of him, to have eyes and to see the people around him, what was right in his immediate vicinity, and to give his time and attention to those things.
That's so good. Casey, we want to move now from the why to the how. That's what practicing the practices is all about. How do we practice this? How do we put it in our life? So let's think of some practical ways people can begin moving towards a simpler schedule and a less hurried pace of life.
The first thing is really simple, which is great since we're talking about simplicity, is evaluating what in your life and in your schedule is life-giving and what's life-draining. And we're going to actually have an opportunity to really practically do this at the end of the podcast and explain how to do this. But just understanding that things in your life and your schedule can either be life-draining or life-giving, and taking the time to evaluate each item in your schedule and recognize which is what.
Yeah. Now, some of the things in our lives that are life-draining, we don't get to remove from the schedule, right? So if you're a young mom and it's life-draining that your 9-month-old is not sleeping through the night, we don't get to pass that one by. But there may be things in our schedules, in our day-to-day lives that are unnecessarily life-draining, and we can take those out.
Yeah.
So the second thing we want to consider is this notion of embracing our limitations. And I know that goes against kind of our Disney Channel childhoods of you can be anything you want, you can do anything you want, but that's just not true. Casey, you are so gifted, but you will never play in the NBA or the NFL. It doesn't matter how hard you work, doesn't matter how much you put your mind to it. Like God made you, the height he made you, right? You're not going to dunk a basketball.
Also, I'm not athletic. So I agree with you. I agree with you.
Those are your words, not mine. You do yoga, so there's probably some athleticism there. Look, I am not mathematically inclined, so like I had to work as hard as possible to make B's on math. So engineering was never going to be a great route for me, but words stuck like Velcro. I could read something, hear something, and remember it, right? So embracing our limitations is actually a pathway to freedom. And specific to this, you've got a particular practice of how we can embrace our limitations in one area that's just kind of, we probably all try to do this one thing. Talk to us about one way we can actually embrace these limitations.
Yeah, if you want a simple way today to make a change in your time and schedule and to simplify, here it is. Stop multitasking. I know many of us just felt that. And myself included, I've actually been trying to practice this in leading up to recording this episode. And I noticed that I'm watching TV, also I'm cleaning, also I'm listening to an audiobook, also I'm trying to have a conversation with one of my kids. And I have to go, Casey, I really say this to myself, Casey, you are cleaning right now.
Yeah.
You don't need to be also having a phone call and also trying to answer an email at the same time. You can just clean, and then when cleaning is done, you can go and answer the email. And while you're doing that, you don't need to be eating lunch and doing 5 other things. So this is I mean, our culture is based around multitasking, so this is very countercultural, but similar to our phones. When you have all those apps, I'm notorious. My kids go and close out all my open apps because I have to like 50 open at once. And they're like, Mom, you got to close those out. It's not good for your battery and your phone doesn't run as well. And they go close all my apps out. Well, our souls are like that. If we have too many apps running in the background of our soul, we're just not going to be able to have our full access to our energy. We're just not going to run as well. Our soul is not going to, it's going to be drained if we have all these things going in the background at the same time. So stop multitasking, stop having 50 things going through your mind at once, and try to just focus on whatever is in front of you. And you might just need to say to yourself, Brad, you are reading right now. You don't need to be doing it. Yeah,
you don't need to do your makeup. You don't need to respond to emails.
Oh, sorry. Were you following me?
No.
How did you know I did my makeup while driving?
Well, I see a lot of people out my passenger side window.
I feel so busted right now.
I've been guilty of all the phone stuff, but it's true.
So stop multitasking. So simple, so hard.
So number one, evaluate what's life-giving and unnecessarily life-draining. Remove that unnecessarily life-draining things. Number two, embrace your limitations. Casey gave you a great example of one way you can do that. Number three, and we won't give any time to this because we've actually done an entire podcast episode on this, but begin to practice Sabbath weekly. And we did episode 114. And Sabbath is so upstream, to take a day to stop, rest, worship, and delight. There's a whole episode that'll talk to you about how you can kind of immerse yourself and take baby steps into that, but begin to practice Sabbath. Number four, and this is one that has really been life-changing for me, and I want to encourage our listeners to take advantage of this resource that we're going to put in the episode show notes description, and it's the use of what I call the ideal calendar. Well, let me say, I don't call it that. Michael Hyatt was kind of the original person I saw develop this tool, and then I took it and kind of created and crafted my own template. So we're going to actually put a template for what's called the ideal calendar in the resources for you to download. And essentially it's this. It is a way of looking at your time the same way you look at your money. Most of us get the concept that we need a budget, that you can only spend what you have. And so you prioritize your budget, mortgage, generosity, auto insurance, groceries, all of these things. And we have a priority list. Like, you might want some new shoes, but if you have to make the choice between mortgage payment and new shoes, like, you make the mortgage payment. Well, we have a kind of life that we want to have, right? We want to be non-anxious people. We want to be people of prayer. We want to be people who are dialed into our families. Well, what would it look like for you to create an ideal calendar that prioritizes those things, and then you put the rest of life in there? And if there's not space for it, it just doesn't get to fit in there. And that seems like, oh man, there's no way I could do that. You can. And you have to maybe start making some small adjustments in your life. And we're going to end our time today with a small practice that can help you do that. But make sure you download the ideal calendar as kind of the fourth kind of practical step towards this, and begin to manage your schedule instead of your schedule managing your life.
So today, as we close out, we're going to leave you with a practice that you can do today to start to realize what needs to go on that calendar and what needs to be left off of your ideal calendar. So when you have a moment today, set aside 30 minutes, 45 minutes, grab a piece of paper and grab your Google Calendar or your paper planner or whatever you use to record your schedule. And make 2 columns on your paper, one for things that are life-giving and one for things that are life-draining. In the Ignatian tradition, the words that he would use for that would be consolation and desolation. Consolation meaning the things in our life that bring more peace, love, and joy, that draw us toward God and toward other people. Desolation, the opposite of that, the things that cause us anxiety, frustration, the things that make us feel like we want to isolate, or we feel apathetic, or we want to pull away from God or other people. So really think through each item that you see in the last week of your life. Think about each thing that you did, each place you invested your time, and write it in one of those two columns. And then when you've got that whole list written out, take some time and prayerfully consider. Look at the items of desolation, the life-draining things on your list. And like Brad said earlier, some of those things you can't really do much about. Some things in life in a fallen world are just hard, and we have to have those things. But I would be willing to bet that there are some things on your calendar that were in that life-draining category that you could eliminate off of your calendar or not give so much energy to. And then look at where you can first fit in the things that are life-giving on your calendar. Put those things in first. Set aside space and preference for those things, and really take a moment to prayerfully consider with the Lord those areas that give life and drain life in your week.
So, closing thought, what Casey is describing is a move from a relentless life with hurry and all of these demands, no space, to a restorative pace of life. A life where in the margin you find healing and you find peace and you find freedom and joy in embracing some of those limitations. Well, for Casey, thanks so much for listening to episode 2 of season 2, Practicing the Practices. As always, make sure you subscribe. Share this episode with someone who you think might find it beneficial. Until next time, grace and peace.